I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with a small print. And today my guest is Malcolm Ray. And as always on this show, we like to ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced. So Malcolm, please tell us about yourself. Who are you and what are you doing in the world right now?
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think a while back I would have answered that question saying that I was many things, journalist, editor, academic, researcher. These days, it's a lot simpler. I think with time, we amass lots of knowledge and data. And I think, what I'm trying to do now is filter out the kind of background noise and focus on the things that matter. So if there's a single thing that I'm an author principally. And I've written a few books, including this latest one, and I plan to write many more for as long as I can.
That's a great introduction. And that's actually why we asked you on the show to talk about your latest book, which has just been published, The Tyranny of Growth. Can you give us a small recap as to what the thesis behind that book is and what people can expect? And then we can get into some of the more detailed conversation that I'm sure people want us to do today.
Yeah, thanks. So, most people, don't know and so can't accept as normal what growth really is. I mean, growth's all around us, and it defines our goals and objectives from government right down to individual households, and that's the sense in which we understand it. And yet, the outcomes demonstrate a pattern, a consistent pattern over time across the world. So I wanted to sort of question that pattern, and essentially that meant questioning, GDP as an economic goal and a measure of success, of prosperity. So that in a nutshell was why the sort of broad canvas initially of the book. The intellectual ambition of the book was to explore the concept of growth and why it has become systematically and ideologically disarticulated from its social and environmental consequences. And that meant a historical treatment of the growth doctrine. It meant going to the weeds and demythologizing some of the stuff that we've come to accept as normal today.
Absolutely. And when we can come to that question of growth, I think for most of us, intuitively, growth feels like a good thing. Like children understand it. You're going to grow up, and this idea of growth as being a sense of progress is, I think, something that is kind of baked into human psyche. But what you really are criticizing here is how that term has been bastardized and twisted by being measured and by being manipulated in very artificial ways. So what we understand to be growth in an economic and a political sense is not necessarily growth in a truly human or truly real sense. So we can go back to that topic, because I think a lot of people listening to this obviously do understand what the concepts like GDP growth really are. But I think there's also some people that find these terms quite vacuous. They're just terms we hear on the news for many, many people. They're not something that we actually fully understand what they are. And I think that one of your things that you speak about is that conflating the ideas of GDP and growth are clearly problematic in many ways. So maybe for the listeners that are not very familiar with sort of technical terms as to what goes into these things, what is a short history of GDP as we know it today? What does that number even mean? This number that we chase and we measure and we compare different economies in different countries by. What is GDP today? What is that number that we are chasing, and why are we chasing it? I know that's quite a big question and you go into it in your book, but I'm sure you have some ways to summarize that for people that are not familiar with the terms.
Yeah, so the short answer to that question is that GDP, is actually the measure and the goal of what is growth. Growth, on the other hand, has a long history, and it predates GDP by several centuries. To understand that context is to understand the relationship between the size of societies, their complexity, the kind of interests that emerge within those complexities, and how those interests compete. And I think that growth as a phenomenon in which we understand it today really emerged after the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, it existed as a measure, so as a goal rather. It existed in agrarian societies as really as the conquest of land by monarchies. With the rise of capitalism and class structure, we were able to sort of distinguish growth as a goal and measure from GDP. As a goal and a form of economic activity, and GDP as a measure of growth. I think the thing that people don't understand is that in distinguishing between the two, capitalism as a system has a few defining signifiers. It's based essentially on private property relations on the one side, and then private capital accumulation on the other, linked to the pursuit of profit. And I mean, we all know that the property system is basically a record of private property ownership. We all accept that. We accept property or private property in whatever form as fixed in fungible assets, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But then we trade those assets by collateralizing them and introducing debt instruments that we trade as non-fungible assets in financial markets. And then when the paper ceases to represent the real value of those assets, that's when we have a systemic problem, and that's when it becomes incompatible with our assumptions about modern social and economic order. And we've seen in recent years in particular how through collateralized debt instruments, derivatives, share certificates, and so on, that the correspondence with real value has been or rather the distance between the two has been growing. With real value, in a sense, moving at a strained angle to the value of the financial markets. So we're sort of overlaying, real value with what is increasingly becoming a malignant crisis of financialization. We're building gambling markets, essentially, or what's typically known, in critical circles as casino economies. So the intersection of these markets with the second signifier of capitalism, which I talked about, which is profit derived from private capital accumulation, is what has come to define the growth doctrine, and of course GDP as a goal and measure of wealth accumulation. In terms of GDP, just to wrap this up, GDP really, contrary to what people assume, emerged in the late 30s and became a policy only for the very first time in 1942 in the United States. Yeah, so it's very, very recent. You're talking just over 80 years. So while we all, kind of chase this thing called GDP, it becomes like the sort of alpha and omega of everything, and we all accept it as something natural. It really is as recent as that, and it was a function, or it was a creation and invention not of iron economic laws. It was a creation of individuals in the United States and in the UK around that time, in the build up to the Second World War. It was intended initially to make sense of it wasn't the precise intention of its inventor, Simon Kuznets, an American economist. But it emerged by default when Kuznets tried to kind of make sense of what was going on after what went wrong during the Great Depression, and what actually resulted in 1929. By default, he'd actually arrived at a national income estimate in the late 1930s. That estimate then became bastardized by Keynesian, what's known as Keynesian economics, which is a result of its originator, John Maynard Keynes. And essentially it was used to justify the cost of weapons manufacturing by the United States in order to convince Congress and the American population that it wasn't a cost to the economy to enter the war.
Yeah, to find a number to kind of justify that. So I think that's kind of the key point here, right? Like GDP is to like geography. It's the map to the territory. It's not the same thing as what it is said to be measuring. It has to, by definition, leave some things out and choose to keep certain things in. And by making those choices, we can essentially sort of skew the landscape, or at least present the landscape as skewed, in order to justify various different, both domestic and international policy interventions into our economies, like you were talking about. So if you can change the numbers and you can put the things into the growth baskets to show that very destructive things, whether it's environmentally destructive or whether it's sort of socially destructive, like investing in things like war technology, for example, you can suddenly justify those by claiming them that they're actually adding to the world of growth. But on reading your book, of course, the sort of the key critique there is that GDP as we know it today is not true accounting. It's not a particularly accurate map about what real growth is, because it has various measures of sort of double and also hidden accounting in it. There's double accounting in that the sort of GDP growth that we know today are often inflated figures, because they essentially double count the same rand being spent twice, whether it's all being earned twice by both the private sector and by the public sector. It leaves a whole lot of other things out too, in terms of sort of things like unpaid labor and other sorts of forms of income that just simply not included in those numbers. But we also have the more dirty side of the accounting in our GDP growth today, in that it doesn't actually account for the costs of that growth. In many cases, we're only measuring the upside, not the downside. We're only looking at the one side of the ledger, the side of where we are actually seeing growth and progress, and not actually the real cost of that. That real hidden cost is both social and environmental aspects to it. And that leads us to sort of question of sustainability. Are there any other factors that have been hidden in the numbers that we have today that are skewing them upwards or downwards in order to make us feel better about a lot of the decisions that we're taking as societies, by sort of hiding behind this idea of growth that in reality isn't necessarily even there?
Yeah, I think that the measure, or the metric that we use to measure growth currently is really a legacy of the post Second World War period that I was talking about, when in adopting the policy of GDP in the United States, state expenditure was included in income, or was basically included in income assessments, national income assessments, and externalities, or what's known as negative externalities, which essentially includes social costs of production, and its environmental consequences, as well as unpaid domestic labor. All other forms of unpaid labor were basically kicked out. Now, nothing has changed since then in how we measure growth. And you're right, it's a form of double accounting, in the sense that today, state expenditure is regarded as a form of investment. And so it's included in our calculation of GDP. What Simon Kuznets had argued, the originator of GDP, was that state expenditure was, he called it a necessary evil, in the sense that it could only be derived, it couldn't be derived from productive investments. It could only be derived from taxes collected from the private sector. And so he felt that it was absurd to include state expenditure as income on national ledgers. And in fact, technically, that's actually true. When you think about it, it's true. But the way in which it's rationalized by governments today, the South African government and all other governments around the world today, is it's rationalized because it's considered, or because state investment is considered a potential stimulus to economic activity, and B, that state-owned enterprises actually do contribute to value. They employ workers, and they produce goods and services, which is actually not entirely true. I think Kuznets' argument still stands, in the sense that the bulk of state revenue is actually drawn from corporate and private household taxes. So when you think about it, we're actually miscalculating growth year on year. That's what we're doing. We're excluding the things that actually matter. I mean, why is it that domestic labor isn't included in our calculations of growth? Why isn't it that we've actually, by definition, informalized large swathes of the economy? We call it the informal sector, and interestingly, and so in that sense, we don't include goods and services produced in that sector. And part of the reasoning there is that because that sector is considered to be underneath the radar, doesn't pay taxes, it's therefore not legal. So these sectors are considered to be illegal economies. Yet, people like Hernando de Soto, the Latin American economist, who in several studies of both Latin America and the African continent, of the informal economies in these continents, discovered that what we're actually sitting with is dead capital that we're not including in our calculations of growth. And by dead capital, he basically meant that it's capital that produces value, but it's capital that we don't mainstream in our economies and in our assessments. And he linked that to what he called, essentially he linked it to the property sector, private property. When you consider informal economies, very few of the individuals in those economies actually legally own private property or private businesses. The bulk of it is illegal. or illegal in the sense in which we've categorized those segments of society today. So, aside from unpaid labor, domestic labor, and I know that governments are trying to move, towards the inclusion of domestic labor as paid labor by regulating households. But besides that, and aside from the exclusion of social and environmental costs, I think the bigger issue really, and it's a growing issue now globally, is the informal sector, the so-called informal economy. And I think the challenge lies in mainstreaming those economies. But the bigger challenge lies, and I think the prerequisite is that if we're going to mainstream those economies, not in the sense that we kind of draw them into the problem, the existing problem, but we find more innovative ways in which to recognize debt capital. We first have to consider the metric, the growth metric. If we don't get that right, then we're essentially only addressing the symptom and not the cause of the problem. So I think the first priority really is to come up with some kind of assessment of what is excluded from our income estimates and from the metric that we use to calculate national income today. And that should be across the board, and particularly now, Bronwyn, in the kind of the emerging complexity of economies around the world on the back of technology. Where a lot of our assumptions are theoretical assumptions about how economies are structured, how labor markets are structured, our assumptions about small businesses. Our assumptions about the relationship between business and labor. I mean, today we talk a lot about the gig economy and the atomization of both enterprises and labor. So what we considered historically to be self-employment, informal self-employment. We now talk about autonomous enterprises. Right, self-employment is no longer self-employment, but autonomous enterprises. So, we also have massive considerations about the inclusion of what's not included in terms of value created online, and whether we can actually, whether we have the capacity and the means to track that, and therefore tax it, and that raises all kinds of complexities in itself.
Because what gets accounted tends to be taxed too, and quite a lot of that can actually impact, particularly on the people working on the margins, right? So there's many incentives in play here. There's incentives both at the sort of public sector level and in positions of power to deliberately exclude or include things that should not be excluded or included in these figures, because what gets measured gets managed, gets manipulated, and bonus schedules and also sort of opportunities for graft, let's be honest here, can be fitted into depending on how we account for these things. But there's also a question about whether people want to be counted for. Like, I know that definitely, particularly in the African and South African context, a lot of people operating in that sort of gray, informal, unaccounted economy are not exactly enthusiastic about being included in the number, because being included in the number comes with a whole lot of, like that book that was put out called Seeing Like a State, which really talks about that. As soon as we start to sort of number and name things, they become managed and controlled in different ways. And that can often push the burden of actually sort of submitting to those numbers onto people at the margins. So there are reasons why the informal economy likes to remain informal, likes to remain in the shadows. But at the same time, there are incentives to deliberately include and exclude at the position of power. And that's perhaps where we can have a more productive conversation, because, look, it's a bit hard to go into why people want to be accounted or not accounted for in these numbers. But in terms of what we currently are measuring as growth, what is currently going into those figures, I'm quite a big believer if we want to understand why things are the way they are, or why things are tending or going to end up in a particular direction, I think that incentives do tend to eat all of our intentions as a very light, like, afternoon snack. It's very that we've got to kind of understand who is being incentivized to track and trace growth at the point that it is being tracked right now, in those numbers that we have right now. What are the incentives involved in including and excluding certain figures in certain communities? I want to ask you this question. I'm asking it on a sort of a more fractal level, on a global level. Who wins at a sort of geopolitical level from the current way that we account for growth? On a more local level too, because we are sitting in South Africa, which is a very complicated society too. Who is winning and who is losing from the way that we're currently tracking those numbers? Who is incentivized to keep on accounting things and hiding and including things the way that we are hiding and including them? Because as long as we do follow those numbers, the whole world, as you said, is geared to chasing these figures of GDP growth. That's the way we vote. That's the way we put people into power. That's the way people retain seats. That's the way people retain privilege in our systems. Who is incentivized to keep accounting the things the way that is accounted for now? And who is actually losing out because of the way that we are accounting? I know you allude to some of these topics in your book, but I wanted to ask you kind of the question head on. It's to what do the incentives say? Who wins from the current way that we are measuring and managing things?
Well, clearly, I mean, in terms of countries as a whole, it's clearly the powerful, sort of Western nations that are the net winners, and that's not something that emerged suddenly. I mean, that's a historical, post Second World War phenomenon. At the level of enterprises, it's certainly the multinational enterprises, the Western multinational enterprises, that are incentivized to actually kind of sustain the current system in both its shape and form. And in terms of why that's the case. In order to kind of, come to grips with why certain segments of society and fractions of capital are invested in the current doctrine, GDP doctrine, it's important, I think, firstly to ask why in grappling with a question like this, very few of us have actually challenged or bothered to challenge the system itself. We complain about the levels of debt in developing countries. We complain about the extent to which labor is exploited by capital. We complain about the rapacity of multinational corporations in developing economies like the African continent. But we continue to do the same thing. And so in a sense, nobody's bothered to challenge the incentives, as you put it. So if we take a step back and ask ourselves, what is going on here, firstly? And we need to come to terms with the fact that we live in a world where we no longer produce goods and services to meet needs. I mean, companies, multinational corporations doing business in South Africa, in the African continent, for example, make a meal of their economic activities at great cost to the continent. Most of that wealth is repatriated back to the host countries, leaving behind massive social costs. So we're not producing. In that sense, we're not producing goods and services to meet needs. We're producing goods and services to make money and for money's sake. And we're measuring success using GDP as a metric by the money we have in our bank accounts. So there you can actually then kind of almost chisel it down some more. And you can argue that those who gain from the current system are, broadly speaking, elites, invested in the system, who actually own assets, who own capital, and who sits nominally in the so-called formal economy. On the one hand, what one has got to understand, as I said earlier on, the origins and legacy of the sort of the system, the world we live in right now. And then on the other, we've got to look at the relevance of all of that to present difficulties, and the kind of almost genocidal logic behind the incentive system that undergirds the economies in which we live. When you consider it at a more micro level, and if you take South Africa as an example, why is it that, if you look at and this is a study I did in 2018, early 2018. I looked at the allocation of incentives just in South Africa. And the absurdity of it is that the bulk of incentives are geared toward the extractive mining sector. Now, we know that mining is a dying sector in South Africa, industry in South Africa, and that its capacity to employ has been dwindling, year on year. And yet we're allocating the bulk of our incentives there. Very little of the incentives just within the mining sector are allocated to communities that have borne the brunt of the extractive mining sector. Very few is allocated along the supply chain of the mining sector, and yet we go on and on and on about the need to beneficiate, about the need to empower small, medium-sized enterprises along the supply chain. But incentives are not allocated accordingly. They're allocated to securing the interests of elites. And who are the elites in the mining sector in South Africa? They're large institutional investors, and they're large mining companies. In recent years, obviously, by the way, they're large mining companies that are multinational, that are foreign. Even though in recent years we've seen some entry by medium-sized Black enterprises into the sector, it's still marginal. So that's just a concrete example of incentives of the net gainers and the complete misallocation of incentives measured against a GDP doctrine that's, in a sense, at a macro level, and then if you drill down to sectors, actually kind of entrenches and reproduces this genocidal absurdity.
Yeah, the absolute skewing of what's going on. So there are two things that I wanted to pick up on there, and that I think link back to some more sort of specific content within your book, and I think is part of this conversation. So I know we're going quite broad, hopefully we'll be able to sort of bring it all back again. The first one is, and you have spoken about it today, the general weirding that's taken place in our financial markets, particularly as things have become more financialized, and as the financialized, virtualized economy has sort of become untethered from the real economy. We're able to hide all sorts of things in complexity because it's weird. Like the financial economy isn't tied neatly to laws of supply and demand. I mean, it is because everything's connected, but there's a lot of ways that we can hide what is going on, that we can push externalities into hidden corners of the market because we're dealing now with abstractions rather than dealing with bald reality that we see in front of us. In terms of that global weirding and what's happening with the disconnect of the financial economy with the real economy and all the opportunities for perversion that come into that, particularly when we start playing with the world of numbers rather than the world of reality, I think it's also interesting to link that concept to a point that you made quite early on in your book, which is that when we start to fully account for all the externalities, growth kind of disappeared sometime in the 1980s. But if we still have growth in places in the world because we're able to sort of hide and obfuscate those externalities and push them into other parts of the world where they kind of go off our ledger. And when I say our, I'm speaking really about, as you were talking about earlier, the people that are in the more privileged positions in the world, whether you're looking at an institutional level or at an international level, which countries are kind of winning and which countries are losing there. And there it kind of moves on to like when you're able to sort of by using the weirdness of abstracted finance to sort of push those externalities out of into different places in the world, into different places, into different times through sort of space and time, we're able to sort of once again entrench those power and privilege patterns, but almost in a sort of very Pontius Pilate, we can kind of wash our hands of what's going on in the world. And it's all really just an accounting trick. It's not real, like the costs are still there, but they've kind of become weirded and abstracted away, and we're able to sort of push things out of sight and out of mind. And we're able then also not just to push it out of sight and out of mind, we're actually able to sort of perpetuate and even accelerate those power and privilege patterns, because now you're able to sort of hide it and justify it underneath these numbers and these abstractions that we've built around us. So I wanted to kind of link that back to what you were saying there about who is winning and who is losing here. And I know I have heard you speak before about what's gone on with the weirding of financial markets and the rapid financialization, and that the casino that's being leveraged upon a casino. It's almost like we've got a casino within a casino that's going on right now, and how this is linked back to that question of accounting and growth that you're already speaking about in your book. Do you have any comments to add there, or to tell me where I'm right or where I'm wrong?
Yeah, I sort of, earlier was saying that, because, and you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that people don't know, which is actually astounding, is what you pointed out, is that if you turn the formula used to calculate growth around, roughly from about the early 80s, studies have shown that the inclusion of the environmental and social costs, this excludes unaccounted informal sector activities. But if you just include that, growth is actually zero, which is really, is really astounding, but that's the reality. I think, what's important in recognizing the problem is to see the kind of spin-off effects of what's not being done. And that because the system we live in is a private property-based, profit-driven system where self-interest is the governing principle of social relations, it actually fits neatly and completely into our not just our assumptions, but our current calculations, our accounting. So nobody bothers to question that, because insofar as they're concerned, it isn't a problem, right? It's actually, as you were kind of intimating earlier in the question you asked me, it's actually in their interest to preserve the system. But what is now starting to emerge, and it's starting to emerge in public consciousness, which is what's so important actually, is that, where self-interest is the governing principle of social relations, people are seeing that hardly any of the wealth generated is invested in socially impactful outcomes like education, healthcare, and food, shelter, etc. It's actually astounding that that on the metric and in our accounting, we for a while got away with the triple bottom line, and we got away with nice to haves like that sit kind of a corporate social investments that appear to be good on our balance sheets. And in our national account, in our annual accounting. Today, I think there's a kind of recognition and a kind of incipient challenge at grassroots level that it's entirely unacceptable not to actually account for these things, both at corporate level and slowly and within a very small segment of the community of economists and some institutions globally. Recognition that actually one needs to have this as an accounting measure at national level in terms of how we calculate GDP. So I was telling you earlier that, you know, the trouble is that, and what people are starting to see is the ideological disarticulation of growth from its social costs. And so here it's important to see how the growth externalities dichotomy, right, is being rearticulated and harmonized in what I call a false dichotomy of inclusive growth today. And we see this particularly emerging from institutions like the World Economic Forum and now actually the World Bank too. Not necessarily the IMF, but the World Bank too. So, you know, it's becoming, you know, this notion of inclusive growth, you know, is becoming a sort of almost a totalizing meta-narrative, you know, to rationalize externalities, not to eliminate them. And so I've got huge problems with it. So you know, the kind of accounting issue, or the thing about accounting, new accounting rather, you've got to be in discussing that and grappling with that. We've got to be very wary about some of the escape valves that large vested interests are trying their hand at to avoid confrontation with some of the real underlying problems that would, on their balance sheets, mean massive costs to their profit margins, or rather massive incursions on encroachments on their profit margins. We've got to be wary of the kind of rhetoric coming out of the World Economic Forum. And we've got to be very wary about official rhetoric by governments around the world. These days, it's fashionable to talk about inclusive growth, to add the pronoun. I mean, you know, so I've said this repeatedly that it's absurd, you know, when you add a pronoun to something like growth, then you know that there's a big problem.
Absolutely. But I want to pick up on that point again, like, again, this accounting question, to just go a little bit deeper into it. So the way that it's sort of played out, we could almost see that accounting manipulation and these sort of figures that are being chased, and you mentioned some of those international bodies too, and the way that our sort of global economies work, can kind of be seen as a form of sort of a neo-colonization, but colonization via accounting rather than colonization by sort of physically going into places, which again comes back to that weirding question, how our world has become weirded and run on numbers and abstractions rather than actually on reality. And when it comes to that sort of colonization via accounting question that we're seeing, because growth is tied so closely to, of course, performance measures in order to get access to global capital as developing markets, that comes with a whole lot of rules and regulations, and that feeds very, very quickly into the sort of debt question. I wanted to ask you two things there. Firstly, what are your thoughts around the sort of colonization via accounting? That seems to be the current way that our world is run. And I think that that's an important one to get into, because what is particularly unfair there from my perspective is that the way that power balance works is that the whole world submits to the same numbers, which are denominated in the same global currencies, like your dollar. So dollar-based GDP is basically the metric with which all countries are judged. But although we're all judged by the same standard, we're not all playing by the same rules, because we have different currencies, different strengths, backed by different degrees of force and faith, which means that essentially we're all playing for the same prize, but playing with a different set of handicaps in that system, which again sort of perpetuates the problems that we're seeing. So the first part of that is, what are your views on the sort of colonization via accounting, well, by the tyranny of the single metric growth doctrine that different people can chase using different degrees of privilege and power. But the other one is, how do you kind of see China fitting into that equation? Because although we do live in a very sort of dollar hegemony based world still, and we must admit that most of those global institutions we spoke to are tied up in dollar-based GDP accounting terms. What are your thoughts on the sort of bipolarization of the economic powers in the world going on right now? We see sort of rumors of dissent coming by, the sort of, as Valina sort of speaks of them as being the sort of dragon bear of China and Russia that are trying to challenge some of this hegemony in a different degree. But how do you see that playing out? Is that also part of this growth question, or is that an entirely different? That's just absolutely sort of a different story for a different day. So maybe you can touch on that, the whole sort of the geopolitics and the strong versus weak dynamics on a geopolitical level when it comes to power via accounting number.
Yeah, I think the accounting thing can't be separated from historical debt, frankly. Obviously the rules of the game and corporate governance rules that may differ from country to country, but more or less, sit within the same doctrine, the neoclassical growth doctrine. And they're more or less standardized by the same measures. The thing is that it can't be separated from the problem of debt, and if there's an accounting trick going on here, how accounting measures are used to camouflage the fundamental problem of debt and the kind of logic or illogic, if you like, of combined and uneven development around the world, in the sense in which we understand the functionality of underdevelopment to the interests of the more privileged developed countries in the world. So understanding the debt problem and its instrumentalization after the 1970s, and the way in which that continues to be lost on accounting, the way in which the necessity to kind of have debt and to use various institutions around the world as disciplining whips to compel weaker countries and weaker interests, to design economic policies to play by the same rules, firstly, and then design economic policies or policies, corporate policies and so on, corporate governance policies and so on, that are essentially based on orientating them away from the kind of stuff that should be on our accounting balance sheets, the productions of consumables to meet needs, towards the extraction of and export by multinational corporations of natural resources to develop countries from developing economies. And I think the entire thing is actually, you've got to see it in that context, and so the whole notion of the rules of the game, and whether there is any kind of sense in applying the same rules to structurally and economically different economies around the world, some that were casualties of the rules of the game set by the West, and then of course the West playing by rules that has always been there. Whether there's any kind of sense in that, in the universalization of these accounting measures. For people who don't understand how egregious this is, the kind of one-size-fits-all accounting model drew emerging capitalist economies in developing parts of the world into its ambit around the early 70s, initially through what was called debt equity swaps, which was really an absurd scheme, and perhaps the first accounting conjuring trick, where currencies in developing economies like Nigeria, where central banks essentially ceded those currencies to multinational corporations through a massive discount window. And then these corporations essentially redeemed the fallout through the sale of currency at market value, and then used that to purchase state assets. None of these sorts of egregious activities were accounted for back then, which created the kind of structural basis for massive inequality in the world. And then years later, using the same kind of universal accounting standards, with the problem already there, already entrenched, you kind of, in a sense, perpetuate the kind of structural imbalances by forcing all countries around the world and all enterprises to comply with the same rules. So it's sort of a combination of systemic and structural problems and inequalities that emerged a long time ago, and rules of the game that were universalized, but rules that actually, accounting rules that basically serve the interests of the stronger and at the expense of the weaker. I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, Bronwyn.
Absolutely, and I think that this is an important lesson for anyone listening to this, to actually think about as we are virtualizing other aspects of our societies. I'm going to just veer off for a second into like what's happening now with our world as it becomes more virtualized, more digitized. What are we essentially doing when we're digitizing our societies is like what we did with our financial system. So we financialize them. When we digitize them, we abstract them, but we also flatten them. We flatten them down to bits and bytes and to numbers. And we end up ruling by the map, and the territory is very disconnected from that. But the territory then gets sort of shaped by the map in very unfair ways. And the more we sort of amplify those abstractions, the more abstract they get, the more we focus on the number and not actually on the reality, the more those systemic sort of inequalities are baked into our reality and they become real, even though they are very arbitrary. I think that's probably the most frustrating thing about reading through your book is how arbitrary these rules, these metrics, these numbers are, but also despite their arbitrariness, they are what has defined and entrenched global inequality. It's defined and entrenched Africa's place in relation to America. It's defined and entrenched the poor's place compared to the rich, and it's so arbitrary. It is imposed. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction that essentially is sort of chaining the world in these sort of invisible chains. And we have to be very, very careful about virtualizing and running things based on code or based on rule or based on number, and then sort of worshiping the number rather than actually seeing that the numbers should be serving us. Now, it's necessary to have maps to guide very complicated territories, but we should never become servants to the map, right? And that's sort of what's happened here. And we have to start to challenge those numbers that are sort of keeping us in our place and say and change the numbers if they're not working for us. I know that's much easier said than done. I know that's the sort of scope of your work and the scope of this conversation is can't really get us to global solutions to like global problems that we won't actually sort of commiserate and actually setting up. But I do know that you do have some thoughts. So I know that we're sort of running out of a bit of time now. And I want to just get a few comments from you on what your plans are next. I know you're talking about sort of setting up an NPO at the moment and actually challenging some of these numbers. And the first thing to challenge them is to start talking about them and to understand them and to understand their arbitrariness. And only then can we have conversations about changing those numbers and focusing our attention differently, because that critical, like trite saying, like what gets measured, gets managed, gets paid attention to, that's what we're actually talking about here. We're paying attention, quite frankly, to the wrong things. And in order to stop that, we have to actually divert people's attention, even at a very micro level, when we start to change that sort of social consciousness, and we start to get the children in the room to point fingers at the naked emperor and say, wait a minute, that guy actually has no clothes on, and these numbers are not working for us. That's the only way we're going to be able to change these systems. As long as we hold the numbers up as some sort of secular god, that's the reality that we're going to have. It's going to be shaped by these numbers. So I did want to give you, of course, the opportunity to close this off, and also to talk about some of the thoughts that you have into how we can start to change this consciousness, however small it might be, and what you're doing in that space.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's what you just said now was really spot on. You know, the thing about accounting today is that it almost, we've reached the point where we're almost, blatantly legitimizing what has been happening. You know, where large swathes of the world, geographically, like the African continent as a whole, have become dumping grounds of the West's externalities. You know,
didn't even get to Larry Summit today.
yeah, it's periodic. We have to mention him again and again. You know, periodic.
Yeah, you gotta know that story, guys. We'll put that in the comments.
yeah. You know, the periodic blunders and excesses of crises of overproduction and resource scarcity in these wealthy economies of the world. Basically all of those excesses are dumped in sometimes more explicit and sometimes more subtle form, in developing countries of the world. And that infamous quote by Larry Summers was, as you put it, just so sickening, and illustrative of the way in which these things are done, almost on a day-to-day basis in the world. I think, by the way, I think that's when people talk about frontier economies and so on of the world, that's what they mean. And I think China's, is not, it can't be excluded from this. In fact, China has been the biggest culprit insofar as dumping externalities are concerned, having started with its own marketization policies in the late 80s, and starting at the bottom end of the kind of the value chain. So for a period of 2 decades or so, producing very cheap goods and services in sweatshops in developing economies around the world. And then having moved up the value chain in more recent years into the tech space and so on, and taking the US on, directly at 2 levels. One, having taken on a lot of its debt through treasury bonds, and then 2, headbutting it basically in terms of competition in its own backyard. And now more recently, the currency war that's been going on for the past 5 years or so, where, a country like China was fine, was perfectly comfortable with the dollar being dominant in the world, because, a cheaper Chinese kind of currency, when it produced cheap goods and services, suited its export markets. These days, the game has changed. As it's moved up the value chain, the dollar's become a problem, and so inflating the Chinese currency has become a key priority. And in fact, the very same thing that happened after the Bretton Woods institutions were formed in the 40s, in an attempt to stabilize the global currency system by universalizing the dollar, is exactly the same thing that's going on in China today. So China, in a sense, the dollar's weakening. China and various African countries, or various African countries, have already accepted both the dollar, which has been an historical thing, and the Chinese currency as dual currencies. Now, I'm not saying that either are acceptable, but what I am saying is that, you know, you can see how around the same kind of economics and the same doctrine, these geopolitical carve-ups are beginning to happen around the world in developing economies. And then between the two hegemons, the emerging hegemon, well, China as an emerging hegemon, how the currency war is beginning to sort of play out on the same doctrine, you know. So yeah, I think
like the new scramble for Africa, like those infamous pictures of, like, you know, Europe carving up Africa, but only now instead of the kings playing, it's more like the currencies, but kind of still playing for the world, right?
Yes.
It's like we not all players in this game are created equal. Some are being played for, and some are being played with, and some are doing the playing. And that's what happens in a world where you have, you know, different rules for different people, and different or a single metric to chase, a single measuring stick, but very, very different handicaps coming into the system, different skill sets available to the different players at different levels. Very unfair.
So you asked about what you know, what are my plans and what am I sort of doing? When I wrote the Tyranny of Growth, you know, I made the point in the book that I didn't write it. I wrote it basically as a diagnostic of the problem. So, you know, even though I kind of suggest a framework in the last chapter of the book, I didn't go into solutions. So the book wasn't designed, or the research design of the book wasn't geared toward solutions. What I'm trying to do at the moment, Bronwyn, is I'm in the process of setting up a nonprofit organization with a group of people, you know, called Counter Narrative. And the idea there is really get conversations going to start with across different levels of societies and across different sectors, and that includes government, policymakers, and so on. But to kind of, in a sense, start to get a conversation going around the problem itself, and then what to do, how to sequence priority interventions over time. And I mean, it's not something that's going to be an overnight success story. It's a work in progress. But I do have some suggestions on, I think, you know, the kind of broad themes, in a sense, that an initiative like this ought to look at. And then in collaboration with similar initiatives and institutions, I'd like to kind of start doing work around more tangible interventions and outcomes. I've identified two sectors that are critical. You know, the first is the financial services sector, and the second is the energy sector. And I think that, you know, roughly in terms of the kinds of interventions across these sectors, I think it's important to shift, or to start to begin to shift the policy discussions toward what we've been talking about, new measures of growth that are socially and ecologically literate. That's important. And I think that the space is there for that to happen, given that there is at least some recognition at certain levels in the world. There's certainly, I don't think for a minute that there's an appetite for it within governments at this point in time. Certainly Western governments that wouldn't and would resist something like this. But it's something that's desirable and possible. And it certainly is a new lens through which we can reimagine prosperity as opposed to growth in the way in which we understand growth. And it doesn't require, ambitious measures or even a new discourse around overhauling capitalism, So this is not about left-wing diatribe. You don't have to overhaul the capitalist system to recalibrate the metrics.
You don't give up on growth either, as you've said before. It's not like we have to reconcile ourselves to a small, shrunk, degrowth future. Rather, it's just a case of reorientating on human flourishing rather than orientating on arbitrary numbers.
Yeah, I'm an advocate of growth. I mean, I'm not opposed to growth. I'm just I have trouble with its framing. So yes, you're right. So we can look at something like a minimalist redefinition of growth, sure. But I think the important thing is to decenter its current framing from the metric, right? And then start to include the social and ecological sort of metrics that we should be using in our measure and calculation of growth. So, and that's perfectly doable. And it doesn't mean radically kind of altering some of our assumptions about growth itself, but it does mean including some of the more important things that currently is rhetoric, things like sustainability, and things like inclusion, or more inclusive societies, without adding a pronoun to growth, I think the second thing that's very important is what we were talking about earlier, I think needs to be done, which is we need to look at the allocation or reallocation of incentives, and disincentives that, encourage and discourage certain things. It certainly discouraged social and ecological ruin, and encourage socially impactful investments. I think this is important. I said earlier that currently the tax incentives of various countries are geared toward extractive sectors in developing countries that are ruinous. So we can start to look at that without dramatic changes, systemic changes to our economies. And then third, and a related point, I think, is that with a new growth metric and incentive systems, we have a basis to not just think about metric and new business models, but basically shift the weight of our goals and our priorities, the priorities that are derived from those goals. So in a sense, it's about redefining our goal. I mean, is the goal growth at all costs, right? Or is it a different kind of growth? I'd probably, just in terms of pushing the debate forward, I would probably want to introduce the notion of prosperity, without adding up any kind of pronoun, just so that people understand that this isn't about semantics, that we're actually looking at a new concept of growth without kicking growth out, and then linking that to a new measure of growth. Yeah. And I think finally,
it doesn't exclude, exactly. It includes more actual real things in it. It's more real people and more fairly.
Exactly. And then I think lastly, the important thing is to kind of, which requires bolder intervention at the level of the discipline itself, of economics, is, we perpetuate year in and year out economists who think in the same way, about things. They come out of business, out of universities, and essentially become part of the problem. And I think we need to remove economics from the monopoly of neoclassical economists. And what I want to do in this initiative is start to kind of think around a more multidisciplinary approach to economics. And historically, what we've done is we kicked out the stuff in the late 1800s that was actually part of the way in which we studied economics at universities in the United States. You know, it had a modelizing mission, but back then economics was just a year-long course in model philosophy. Now, I'm not saying that we need to kick economics out; it's a critical discipline. But
economics needs to remember itself. It needs to remember like the origins and Adam Smith and looking at the world from a broader perspective.
Exactly.
It's become mathematicalized over time. It's become full of numbers, and it's
become full of numbers.
People, right?
Yeah. And so having that multidisciplinary approach, and you know, so you know, bringing the softer disciplines into it, the social sciences and so on, is important in rethinking an economics that you know in itself isn't part of the problem of what increasingly is becoming the financialization of discourse and financialization of investments and so on.
From my perspective, economics should be about instrumental and empirical rationality, right? It should be understanding trade-offs and incentives. That's the role of the field. When you lose sight of that and turn it actually into an objective game, into a chasing numbers game, it's a very different field. That's business studies, right? That's for the other department next door.
That's for the other department next door, which can't be excluded from the problem.
No,
the net
they must be
result is
involved,
that fund managers
but if they have a different incentive.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Bronwyn, I mean that's where I'm going with this initiative. I mean it's not as if I'm trying to build a new enterprise. It's essentially a labor of love, and it's something that doesn't have a start and end date. As I said earlier, it's a work in progress. And I think the most important thing about this is it really is a flat structure that I'm trying to create that's a collaborative initiative that I hope would take on a life and form as it evolves, right? You know, so it doesn't proceed from a fixed design. It's something that I see as an evolutionary kind of construct that is, you know, that hopefully will be owned or co-owned by everybody.
Absolutely. So if people are interested in this, where can they find you if you want to be found? Where can they get hold of your book? Where can they engage in this conversation about the institutions that you are hoping to shape and the conversations you want to start? How can you be found if you do want to be? And then, of course, thank you so much for joining us today, being so generous with your thoughts and with your time.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you. So the book can be purchased at exclusive bookstores, actually all leading bookstores nationally, and it is at all exclusive bookstores. It can also be ordered from exclusive books or using Loot, or go directly to my publisher, NB Publishing, to find details, to order copies. I can be found on Facebook. Unfortunately, I'm a new entrant to social media. So I set up a page for the Tyranny of Growth. You can find me both on my name, Malcolm Ray, or the Tyranny of Growth, or one word. Yeah, I mean, I'm you know, I hope that people will engage some more in some of the discussions that I've started on the Facebook page around the Tyranny of Growth. I will be posting some information on the nonprofit organization I'm setting up from this point forward, and hope that you know, that more and more people will come onto collaborative platforms that I'm creating, and some of the conversations that I'm going to be hosting as well on podcasts and webinars.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And it's been a privilege.
Thanks, Brownyn.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.